Gives us great pleasure to be holding our inaugural program of our 2023 series, Long Island's First Peoples. Today we have with us Professor Ed Folsom, who is the Roy J. Carver Professor of English Program at University of Iowa, and Sandi Brewster-walker, who is the Executive Director of the Montaukett Indian Nation and Government Affairs Officer. I'd like to welcome you all today. There it goes. And remind you that this program is being recorded. If you would like to speak in our question and answer period, press your hand icon or in the chat room, however that works for you. And I would like to thank the Huntington Arts Council, who has given us funding for this series through the New York State Council of the Arts Programming funding. So I welcome you all here today. We're going to have a wonderful discussion, enlightening in many, many ways, and I look forward to all of it. I would like now to introduce our facilitator for the series, Sandi Brewster-walker. Her bio is up here on the screen, and I will read it. She is an independent historian, genealogist, freelance writer, and business owner. She is chairperson for the Board of Trustees and acting executive director for the Indigenous People Museum and Research Institute. She has served in the President William J. Clinton's administration as Deputy Director of the Office of Communication at USDA. Brewster-walker is a member of the Montaukett Indian, I can't read the rest of this here, the Montaukett Nation, okay, and Executive Director of the Government Affairs Officer. In the Long Island region, she is a member of the Board of Directors for the Long Island Museum and the Friends of, Sandi, I can't read that word there.
The Connecticut State Park.
Okay.
Is that what you are?
Well, I think I was a little ahead of that.
Okay.
The Friends of, is it People's Island?
Oh, yes, Plum Island.
Okay. Oh, Plum Island. Okay. And also, she is the advisory board member of the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Museum and the Friends of Connecticut River State Park. In 2017, she was the winner of the President of Long Island Media Award for third place for narrative, her column. So as you can see, she's a very active woman. I'm working with her for these past few months, and she is a hard worker, always available, and she gets a lot done because I know she gets up at 3 or 4 a.m. to start her busy day. So welcome, Sandi, and welcome, Ed Folsom. We're thrilled to have you here. And now, Sandi, if you would like, please go on with the program.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And it is true that I get up about 2 or 3 in the morning to do work. I'm just going to give a brief overview on the series that I'm very excited about, that I developed along with Walt Whitman's birthplace, Heather and Cynthia. And then I'll introduce Professor Folsom, and he'll do his presentation. And then we'll do the Q&A after. And then I'll thank you. And hopefully I'll see you for the next couple of months, once a month. First, before we begin, I just wanted to mention that in John Strong, and many of you know him because he's spoken at numerous events we've done, as well as all over Long Island, and he's the Long Island expert. His quote is up here. I don't want to read a lot of this because I want to get right to the presentation, but he kind of goes into all of the trials and stuff that we have gone through, the Montaukett Indians, and how we have almost been erased in some cases from Long Island's history. And that's kind of what prompted this series. It's 6 programs, and this is the first. And the next program, and my screen is not showing it all, but the next program is on eugenics, and that's with Professor John Strong. And then in September, we'll be talking about the boarding schools, because most people have heard about the boarding schools and also the missionary schools. but they don't realize that people from Long Island were part of these boarding schools, Carlisle, and then you had missionary schools before that. And it was a horrible experience for many. And in October, we'll be talking about the missionaries, mainly because I'm fascinated by Azariah Horton, who was ordained in 1741, and he leaves Jamaica walking, and he walks to Rockaway, and he had been ordained to preach to the Montauketts, but in Montauk Point, and he actually walks along the South Shore from Montauk Point, from Rockaway to Montauk Point, and he stops at places like Jerusalem, which is Wantor, or West Neck, what was Amityville, but he's actually telling where all of these clusters of Native Americans were. So that's going to be fascinating. And then in November, as many of you know, Chief Harry Wallace teaches out the Algonquin language, and he's going to be talking about that, as well as the many places that are named after the Native Americans on Long Island. And these will all be virtual. And then in December, we'll be on site. Hope to see everyone there at the Walt Whitman birthplace. And I'll be speaking about the 400 and some odd whalemen of color from Long Island, all over Long Island. And Lance Gumps who's vice president of NCAI, that's the National Congress of American Indians. He'll be talking about the Circassian shipwreck that took place down east. And that's the series that we'll be dealing with once a month. And I just wanted to mention too, if you look in your left-hand corner, many of you have seen this picture already, but that's a photo of Montaukett Indians, mainly the Farrell family. I put this slide together because, as many of you know, if you've spoken to me before or heard me talk, I'm always separating the Indians east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi, because the Indians east of the Mississippi had first contact around the 1600s and with the explorers in the 1500s, where 200 years later, with the Louisiana Purchase and things like that, and then the move west and the Trail of Tears and everything, then the natives west of the Mississippi had first contact, even though we're all Native Americans, but we had this first contact with the Europeans at different time periods. And that's kind of very important to keep in mind as Ed talks. This is a statement, and I'm not going to read it through because I want to get to Ed's talk, but if any of you want this, I can have it sent to you. It's a statement I found in the Walt Whitman archives, and there's an article online about it too. And I'm sure Ed's going to mention it when Whitman actually went down to Montauk and the negative views he had about the Montaukett Indians there. And we might even go back to that later. Now, as I was putting together the slides and thinking about the program, I looked at the lifetime of Walt Whitman. He was born in 1819, I think in Huntington, if I'm not mistaken, and he dies around 1892 or something like that. And I was thinking about words that really talked about that period in history. And this is a list of them. The Native Americans had become invisible. They were stereotyped. We were victims of genocide, victims of cultural destruction, and we were subject to some mythical ideas, and we were romanticized by most people that were non-Indians. And keep that in mind as Ed is talking also. And now what I'd like to do is to introduce Ed Folsom, and I'm not going to read his whole bio, and I cut it down on here because it's quite large, but he is a professor of English at the University of Iowa, And he's the most important thing, I think, is that he's the editor of Walt Whitman Quarterly Review and co-director of the online Walt Whitman archives, and the editor of the Whitman series at the University of Iowa Press. Now, what I did in the flyer that you got from me, or from the Montaukett Indians and Chief, I put in a link to the Walt Whitman archives because I'm becoming fascinated about it. So I hope that you, after this talk, will go in and just kind of browse through, and let's learn more about Walt Whitman and the Walt Whitman birthplace, because if you've ever been to the Walt Whitman Mall, you've passed right by his birthplace. So once again, I'm looking forward, before he comes on, to seeing everyone in December at the reception. And Ed, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sandi, and Cynthia, thank you too, both of you, for setting up this important and long overdue program. I'm looking forward to all the events, and hope to see all of you who are here gathered today at those events this fall and into the winter. I've thought about Whitman and Native Americans for probably 35 years now, that I've been writing about his attitudes toward Native Americans, toward African Americans, toward Asian Americans. Whitman's views on race are often problematic, and we have this amazing group of poems in Leaves of Grass that sets up a new way of thinking about the world and about life. And it's a democratic eye that is absorptive and celebrates diversity and celebrates contradiction and celebrates all of the things that hold the United States of America together. In Whitman's mind, the United States were a kind of analog for the self. All of us are contradictory, diverse beings that exist in one body. And Whitman celebrated that diversity again and again. But in his journalism, often in his conversations that were written down, he makes statements that places him in the very biased and discriminatory world of the 19th century. And as I talk to you today about Whitman's views of Native Americans, it's important to keep in mind that Whitman's great achievement, I think, was that he was able to construct and imagine a democratic eye that he captured and articulated in his poetry, that was an eye that was so much richer and better than the historical self of Walt Whitman in the 19th century. Whitman knew he himself shared the biases and discriminations of his time, but he could imagine an eye that transcended those biases and discriminations. And I think that's his great achievement. What I'd like to do today is just give you a kind of overview of Whitman's views of Native Americans, interactions with Native Americans over his lifetime, and then do something that I've discovered over the many decades that I've dealt with Walt Whitman, that the best way of understanding Whitman is by reading what other American poets have written about him, what they've said about him, the ways they've talked back to him, the ways they've entered into conversations with him. And I want to think a little bit today with you about how some Native American poets have responded to Walt Whitman. But we'll start with a kind of overview. And I'm going to more or less disappear from my screen. And share this. Are you all seeing an image there of the Trail of Tears? Okay, great. Whitman's adult life was framed by two of the defining events in 19th century Native American history. The infamous Trail of Tears in 1838 and 39, when Whitman was 20 years old, and the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, just over a year before his death. During Whitman's teenage years, the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, and finally the Cherokees were moved across the Mississippi and into the Oklahoma Territory. During the formative years of Leaves of Grass, many of the most explosive Western battles between natives and whites occurred, including the Pueblo Uprising in 1847, the Graton Fight in 1854, the Rains Fight in 1855, the year that Leaves of Grass first appeared. As Leaves of Grass grew through its various editions, countless battles and skirmishes took place, and their names entered the American memory. Birch Coulee, Canyon de Chelly, Rosebud, Warbonnet Creek, Sand Creek. By the time of Whitman's death, Wounded Knee had underscored the fact that active armed Native American resistance to the United States had come to an end. Whitman was not unaffected by Native American life and events. While his own experience with Native Americans was limited, it was not insubstantial. He encountered American Indians as a boy on Long Island and as a young editor in New Orleans. He admired Indian troops who fought in the Civil War, and he was the only major American poet to work in the Indian Bureau of the Department of the Interior. He worked there for 5 months in 1865 during a period when that bureau was negotiating some of the most important treaties with Native Americans. And while he was there, he met several impressive Native delegations and had what he called, quote, quite animated and significant conversations with them. On his Western trip in the 1870s, he commented on the Indians he met in Topeka, and he visited a Chippewa settlement during his trip to Canada in 1880. Whitman's interest in Native Americans is evident from very early on in his writing. One of his earliest published poems is called The Inca's Daughter, about the noble suicide of a captive Indian maiden. And his 1842 temperance novel, Franklin Evans, contains a long chapter called The Death of Windfoot that consists of a Native American revenge tale. A few years later, he wrote a novella, The Half-Breed, a tale of the Western frontier, about a deformed and treacherous amalgam of the worst qualities of the white and red races. He wrote frequently about Native Americans and their history in various newspaper essays and articles. In the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Native Americans appear in 5 of the 12 poems, including the poem that would later be titled The Sleepers, where Whitman records a haunting dream memory of a red squaw, as he calls her, who visits his mother for an afternoon, seeking work, and then disappears forever. And in the poem later entitled Song of Myself, where he offers an extended tableau of what he calls the marriage of the trapper in the open air in the far west. The bride was a red girl. A scene that he based on a painting by J. Alfred Miller that has been read as suggestive of the white domination of the native, but also indicative of the possibility of a joining of the races and all they represented in 19th century America. In a notebook that he kept in the late 1850s, Whitman sketched out plans for a poem of the Aborigines that would incorporate, quote, every principal Aboriginal trait and name. He never wrote that poem, but Leaves of Grass contains more Native American elements than is generally noted. In starting from Paumanok, for example, Whitman pauses to, quote, pronounce what the air holds of the red Aborigines. And he goes on to catalog their names: Oconee, Coosa, Ottawa, Monongahela, Sauk, Natchez, and to lament the natives' disappearance while celebrating the way they have, in the last line here, you can see it, quote, charged the water and the land with names. This is going to be such a crucial thing for Whitman and his interactions and reactions to Native Americans. Whitman loved Native American words. All Aboriginal names sound good, he announced in his American primer. What name a city has, what name a state, river, sea, mountain, wood, prairie has, is no indifferent matter. All Aboriginal names sound good. I was asking for something savage and luxuriant, and behold, here are the Aboriginal names. I see how they are being preserved. They are honest words. They give the true length, breadth, depth. They all fit. Mississippi. The word winds with chutes. It rolls a stream 3,000 miles long. Ohio, Connecticut, Ottawa, Monongahela, all fit. Names are magic. One word can pour such a flood through the soul. He would argue again and again that native names should replace the various classical and European names that had been imposed on the North American continent. His own efforts at reinstituting native names included his insistence on calling Long Island Paumanok and New York City Manhattan. Native words had an authenticity for Whitman. They fit the American landscape, and absorbed into English, they tinctured the language with native sounds. Whitman was therefore annoyed with the word Indian because it was an example of European misnaming. The imposition of a misidentification upon a whole group of cultures. And these are his notes about that, where he writes, quote, a great mistake perpetuated in a word, calling the American Aborigines Indians, he wrote, is a lesson in how, quote, names or terms get helplessly misapplied and wrenched from their meanings. Whitman himself preferred the term Aborigine with its echo of original, but mostly he loved to list and say the various tribal names, as we saw in starting from Paumanok, Wabash, Miami, Saginaw, Chippewa. While Whitman occasionally employed the language and assumptions of savagism, with its attendant belief in the inevitable demise of the natives in the face of the United States' claim to manifest destiny, he also was capable of questioning and complicating those assumptions, as he did in Song of Myself. When he called for a new, quote, friendly and flowing savage, whose mysterious appearance would help unsettle the already too repressed American civilization. Whitman's attitudes toward Native Americans remained ambivalent and wavering throughout his life. He could condemn natives in reductive and stereotypical ways, as when he wrote in these notes about a lecture he had just heard, where he says, "The real Reds of our northern frontiers of the present day have propensities monstrous and treacherous that make them unfit to be left in white neighborhoods." But he could also celebrate them as some of the noblest examples of humanity. Quote, "There's something about these Aboriginal Americans and their highest characteristic representations and essential traits that arouse comparisons with our own highest civilized ideals." Finally, though, Whitman's evolutionary faith led him to accept the notion that Native Americans were doomed to extinction, the victims of a Darwinian struggle of races and cultures. He usually expressed sadness at this inevitable loss, as he did in his late poems Red Jacket, From Aloft, Yanandio, and Osceola. These poems, written in the last decade of his life, were final acknowledgments of the importance he ascribed to the presence of Native Americans in the developing American poem. Whitman wanted to include them, even as they seemed to be disappearing as an active part of American history, and he wanted to afford them a kind of linguistic afterlife by employing their words for places so that every time Americans spoke the names of the country's towns and states and rivers, their voices would echo with native sounds. Whitman then was ultimately more interested in the representation of Native Americans than in their actual cultures. He knew George Catlin, the artist who portrayed Indian cultures, and he kept a print of Catlin's portrait of Osceola on the wall of his Camden home, and he supported the movement to have the United States government purchase Catlin's collection of Indian paintings so that the nation could have a collective visual memory of the tribes. One of Whitman's favorite paintings was John Mulvaney's Custer's Last Rally, and he wrote a long meditation about the painting's conflicted portrayal of the natives, a portrayal that resonated with Whitman's own handling of the Custer battle in his 1876 poem called From Far Dakota's Canyons. As we think of Little Bighorn and how Custer's defeat led inevitably to the massacre at Wounded Knee, it's worth pausing to consider how contemporary Native American writers have responded to Whitman's poetry in a variety of ways. Much of that response is through a reaction to Whitman's own attitudes or absence of response to those massacres. So a remarkable aspect of the contemporary dialogue with Whitman involves Native American poets. Norma Wilson claims that no Ameropean before Whitman had ever, quote, approximated so close the Native Americans' conception of the spiritual and commonplace as one. She does not see Whitman's perspective as Native American, but believes, quote, that the important source and intention of his art were essentially the same as those of Native American writers. William Least Heatmoon endorses Whitman's affinity with Native Americans and fuses Whitman's ways and native ways in his book, Blue Highways, a record of his journey on what's left of the open road in America. He drives his van named Ghost Dancing and carries two guidebooks, Whitman's Leaves of Grass and Gary Neihart's Black Elk Speaks. Joseph Bruchac an Abenaki Indian, finds, quote, much in Whitman which reminds me of the American Indian way of looking at the world. And he senses, quote, Whitman's spirit in his own writing and in the work of some of the finest of the new generation of Native American writers, including Leslie Silko and the Acoma writer Simon Ortiz. James Nolan has written an entire book called Poet Chief that examines Whitman's and Pablo Neruda's poetry as based on Native American poetics, with its shamanistic beliefs of defining the individual only by his or her relationship to the whole in a constant flux, a continual renewal. The problem with finding Whitman's spirit in Native American works is that his spirit is many-sided and changeable. There's a Whitman spirit that is expansive and dominating, that can imagine the last redwoods gladly giving way to the axes of what he calls the superber race. But there's also a Whitman spirit that absorbs and caresses, that catalogs and celebrates difference, that extols a self that embodies diversity. Of every hue and caste I am, Whitman writes, of every rank and religion, I resist anything better than my own diversity. So for many recent American writers, the questions that they ask Whitman have to do with this contradictory nature. Does Whitman speak for the white pioneer, or does he speak for an America that thrives on a diversity of its peoples? The dominating and imperialistic side of Whitman's spirit has led some contemporary Native American writers to view Whitman in purely negative terms. Maurice Kenny, a Mohawk poet, mourns Whitman's, quote, indifference to the Indian, and believes Whitman's heroes are the Custer-like scouts, frontiersmen, and Indian fighters. Quote, Whitman apparently was a proponent of the manifest destiny bilge, and he, quote, closed his ears and shut his eyes to the Indians' death cries. But for me, the most interesting and extended of the Native American responses to Whitman is Simon Ortiz's long poem called From Sand Creek, where he speaks of how America is the result of what he calls culturing white anxiety. From Sand Creek is a poem in which Whitman is evoked and implicated, and it becomes a telling text for an examination of Whitman's relationship to American Indians, a difficult and complex weave of attitudes that I can only begin to suggest here. Ortiz wonders about how Whitman felt about the American decimation of native cultures as he led his pioneers, oh pioneers, on a ceaseless journey upheaving the virgin soil until they faced west from California's shores, still wondering, as Whitman wrote, quote, where is what I started for so long ago, and why is it yet unfound? But this same Whitman, or perhaps a different one, also is the poet who sought to absorb the Indian, who wanted to speak a native tongue, whose dream of democratic variety occasionally embraced them. Whitman manifests for Ortiz the divided white consciousness, destroying what it desires as it comes to desire what it has destroyed. For those of you that haven't read From Sand Creek, Ortiz has a little prose gloss on as he writes this poem about the Sand Creek horrific massacre. There's a little running commentary in small print in the margins of his book, and I'm going to give you a couple of those to illustrate the ambivalence that Ortiz has about Whitman. In a prose gloss to the poem, Ortiz inscribes his growing uncertainty about Whitman. When I was younger, he writes, and America was young too in the 19th century, Whitman was a poet I loved, and I grew older, and Whitman was dead. Whitman remains for Ortiz a mystery, at once both the spiritual leader of America's destructive urgings of manifest destiny and the leader of the resistance to those destructive impulses, the poet of love and nature. In From Sand Creek, Ortiz raises the vexing question of how Whitman would have reacted to the news of the Sand Creek massacre of Cheyennes in 1864, when the U.S. commanding officer, Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister, ordered his troops to, quote, kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice. Over 100 Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children and 28 men were slaughtered by more than 700 U.S. troops, who committed countless atrocities and then rode triumphantly into Denver, displaying the scalps of Cheyenne women and children. Ortiz can imagine Whitman reacting with sorrow to such episodes in America's bloody Westering process, but he can also imagine him reacting like the whites who cheered the troops in Denver with mirth. And the most troubling possibility of all for Ortiz is that he can imagine Whitman not reacting at all. They wasted their sons and uncles as they came westward, sullenly insisting that perhaps, oh Whitman, he was wrong and had misread the goal of mankind. And Whitman, who thought they were his own, did he sorrow? Did he laugh? Did he? Did he? We do not, in fact, know how or if Whitman reacted to his American compatriots' behavior at Sand Creek, but we do know more generally his attitudes toward the Indian massacres that happened so frequently during his adult life. The year before Sand Creek, Whitman registered his attitude toward Indians on the prairies and plains as he reacted to the reports of an Indian massacre of whites in Minnesota. It was enough to harrow one's soul. The poetical Indian is all lollipop. The real reds of our northern frontiers of the present day have propensities monstrous and treacherous that make them unfit to be left in the white neighborhood. The details of their murders, mutilations last fall in Minnesota, and the violations of women and children make as bloody and heart-rending an episode as there is in American history. I want to just mention one thing that Simon Ortiz did not know about, and something I only discovered quite recently as I've been editing for the Whitman Archive all of Whitman's correspondence, including all the letters written to Whitman as well as all the letters Whitman wrote. 3 of the letters written to Whitman in the early 1860s, 1862, 1863, were from Captain Silas Sewell, pictured here, who was a captain under Chivington's command. Chivington was the colonel who led the Sand Creek massacre. When Sewell saw what Chivington had in mind, taking the 700 American troops and not only killing but mutilating the bodies of women, old men, and children, Sewell ordered his men not to attack. And he had his men witness what occurred, and then Sewell, a couple of months after the Sand Creek Massacre, testified in an Army hearing about what he had seen. And his description is harrowing. I'm not going to read it all. I think most of you have probably read many descriptions of the horrifying Sand Creek Massacre. But as he talks about how the massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours, I tell you, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her, and so on and so on. But down at the very bottom of this testimony, he said, "You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. But every word I have told you is the truth, which they do not deny." A few months after this testimony, Sewell was assassinated in Colorado. And while the people who murdered him were known, they were never charged, and no one was ever ultimately charged with Sewell's murder. But it was clearly a revenge for his having testified against his commanding officer, Chivington, for the Sand Creek Massacre. I raised Sewell simply because Sewell wrote 3 letters to Whitman in months just before the massacre. This is one of them. And in that letter, he talks about how he had met Whitman back in Boston in 1860. And he said, "When I left Boston, I came to Kansas, and from there out here among grizzly bears, Indians, Yankees, and almost every species of man and beast that inhabit the globe." He's writing from out near the Rocky Mountains. "I've lived on venison, and I've lived on bread, and I've gone hungry for many a day, and I've had plenty to eat for many more. I have often heard leaves of grass highly spoken of away out here, but have never seen a volume until a few days ago. And the man who has that will not dispose of that for any price. He brought it out with him to this country." Interesting to think of Silas Sewell at the Sand Creek Massacre carrying, and not the only one carrying, a copy of Leaves of Grass with him. And interesting to think of whether it was something in Leaves of Grass that would prompt Chivington to undertake the massacre, and or whether it was something in Leaves of Grass that would prompt Sewell to refuse orders to attack and then testify against the massacre. I want to just go back to say 1 or 2 more things about the Ortiz poem. By the time Whitman was born in 1819, all the major battles between whites and Indians east of the Mississippi had been fought. Whitman grew up knowing the eastern region as the secure United States. But during his adult years, a series of explosive battles west of the Mississippi occurred. And I've listed those for you before. These were the troubling battles that America fought to take back what earlier explorers had dismissed as the great American desert, the land west of the Mississippi that it then seemed only the Indians could ever want. Whitman's adult years were framed by the Great Removal when he was 20 and the Wounded Knee Massacre when he was 70, as I've mentioned. And like many Americans who lived through this period, he never stopped struggling with what he thought of as the insoluble, quote, Indian problem. The Indians he knew had been abused and treated unjustly, but he also subscribed to the notions of progress and social evolution and believed that it was inevitable and ultimately valuable that the United States extend itself from sea to sea in service of the largest result of the whole body of the states, as he said. Ortiz's From Sand Creek is an attempt to understand the attitudes that produce the United States, not to protest the attitudes so much as to locate the sources of such feelings in himself. Ortiz, after all, is a US citizen educated at American colleges. He blends his Acoma heritage with an American history and thus contains contradictions and tensions, the competing claims of the American past situated deep within himself. In that sense, Ortiz's purpose is Whitmanian in spirit, to discover difference not outside the self, but rather embodied within the self. As Ortiz writes, "From Sand Creek wasn't a product of protest at all," he says. "I simply wanted to look at what I was as an American and to find a way for me to look at what that means as an American citizen, an Indian, a writer, a victim, a victimizer. I wanted it to be a study of history, but also a study of myself." So Ortiz in his poem explores how things might have been different, how the white man might have become, as Whitman once expressed it, the friendly and flowing savage, how the opportunity of melding with the native, of giving the self over to the land, was once there and then was lost. It was the failure of Americans to absorb the Indian, to marry, in Whitman's terms, the trapper and the red girl, to manifest the friendly and flowing savage, that led finally to white man's construing of the Native American as alien and other, as dangerous and primitive, as worthy of extermination. Whitman in 1855, in Song of Myself, had articulated the right dream, a dream of amalgamation, of melding, of absorption, and open embrace. But he and his dream died, as Ortiz registers in one of those marginal annotations in From Sand Creek. Oh, Whitman spoke for them, of course, but he died. That shed their sorrow and shame and cultured their anxiety. They spoke an eloquent arrogance by which they thought they would be freed in their theaters, in their factories, in their wars. The Whitman, who was the poet of the Aborigine, of the emergent, friendly, and flowing savage, the poet who sought to, quote, speak for them, died, in Ortiz's view, long before the aged Walt Whitman, who died in 1892 in Camden, New Jersey. By the time of the Sand Creek Massacre, Whitman was no longer arguing for the embrace of Aborigines, but rather was cataloging their inevitable disappearance, sometimes with sentimentalized grief, sometimes with indifference, and was trying to touch them one last time, grasp a fading memory of them, as in his late brief poem, Inandio. With the natives would vanish a vital part of Whitman's diverse and democratic self. Did he sorrow? Ortiz wonders. Did he? Gary Snyder, a poet whose concern and identification with Native Americans is deep and long-standing, has expressed similar ambivalence about Whitman's attitudes toward Indians. While admitting that he loves to read Whitman aloud, quote, he's a good communal poet in that way, and finds him, quote, inspiring, he also questions the fullness of his commitment to democracy and insists on testing Whitman's ideas in multicultural and ecological ways. Quote, when he says there should be more democracy, I go along with that. We all see what more democracy means, too. It means that the Navajo should get their own nation, that Rosebud and Pine Ridge maybe should be a separate nation, that the Indians of Puget Sound have fishing rights, that trees and rocks should be able to vote in Congress, that whales should be able to vote. That's democracy. He's concerned that Whitman's, quote, faith in progress and in the future of the USA assumed a kind of melting pot future in which other races, Asians, American, African American, and Native American, would eventually cheerfully join up with the somewhat spiritualized and liberalized mainstream white Protestant values that are the metaphysics behind Whitman's dream. But, Snyder argues, quote, the etiquette of mutual respect, both among human beings and between human and non-human realms, is much more complicated than that. Like Ortiz, Snyder suspects that Whitman's projected future did not truly respect variety or diversity. The best Snyder can hope for is that, quote, if Walt Whitman were with us today, he might well give his heart to the new native and bioregionalist movements with as much hope and perhaps hopelessness as he gave to his own uniquely enlightened version of the 19th century dream of progress. Whitman's ideas of democracy would have matured and radicalized Snyder trusts had he lived through the 20th century. More recently, the Spokane Coeur d'Alene Indian writer Sherman Alexie has evoked Whitman in poems that demonstrate a similar ambivalence toward him and his poetic project. In a poem called Defending Walt Whitman, Alexie plays on the word defend. The poem is at once a defense of Whitman and his ideals, but also a defending against Whitman and his usurping poetics. The poem takes place, quote, on a reservation summer basketball court, where, quote, young Indian boys compete vigorously, putting up beautiful arcing jump shots so that the ball, quote, makes a sound when it swishes through the net that causes Walt Whitman to weep because it is so perfect. Surrounded on this court by the bodies of native boys, quote, every body is brown. Whitman waits to join in the game and, quote, dreams of the Indian boy who will defend him, trapping him in the corner, all flailing arms and legs and legendary stomach muscles. Whitman's love of young men is now transferred to Indian boys on a basketball court. But Whitman is hopelessly out of place. Quote, he is a small man and his beard is ludicrous on the reservation, absolutely insane. His beard makes the Indian boys laugh righteously. His beard, his beard. Whitman's beard, the symbol of his power in Hispanic traditions, is simply the marker of absurd difference on the reservation. And out here, Whitman is, as he always claimed, quote, both in and out of the game. Quote, Walt Whitman cannot tell the difference between offense and defense. And so he smiles and shakes, knowing that somehow, despite his exclusion in this place, quote, this game belongs to him. But out on the reservation, Whitman seems small, shrunken, as his old body shakes, with fear, with lust, with age, with regret, to see the strong young brown bodies adapting so naturally to the American game. In another poem, that's the end of the Indian poem up on the top of the screen here, but at the bottom is another very short poem called Song of Ourself. Alexie quietly chants a reversal of American history as a ghost dance-like growing number of Native Americans silently accumulates while the Whitman white men are busy celebrating themselves. While Walt Whitman sang about his body, the still body of one Indian grew into 2, then 10, then multitudes. Lurking behind this poem, though, is a darker suggestion. Whitman's expansive American song came at the expense of multitudes of still bodies of Indians massacred in the name of American progress. But that final word, multitudes, echoes Whitman's boast that I am large, I contain multitudes, and now challenges the old poet and all his heirs to begin to atone for the past by recognizing and embracing the diversity of the multitudes on this continent. I'm going to stop there. And if I can stop my sharing, there we go. I will be glad to take questions, and I know Sandi will be glad to step in here and help answer questions as well.
Are there any questions? I lost my screen.
Yes, Mark.
Yes, first, I'd like to congratulate both you and Sandi. Powerful presentation. I'm one of the members of the board of directors at Walt Whitman, and it just pinned me against the wall. The way you delivered this and how you explained the both sides of Walt Whitman's attitude towards the Native Americans, and how he always had this ideal, but like most of us, because we're all human beings, we don't always live up to it entirely. So I just want to congratulate both of you. This is a very exciting program.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, very nicely said. You capture exactly what I was aiming to capture in Whitman and his work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I'm not going to read them from the chat box. So if you could raise your hand or just ask the question. Because I have some that come into the chat box. Okay. Jenny, do you want to unmute?
Sure, thank you. It's an absolutely fantastic talk. So I'm from Britain, so I'm very interested in the sort of Bolton, sort of Whitman, Eagle Street College side of it. So I was particularly interested in Edward Carpenter, because he was one of Whitman's British followers, as I'm sure you all fully know much more than I do. And I was interested in when he quotes Whitman's line, "The friendly and flowing savage, who is he? Is he waiting for civilization, or is he past it and mastering it?" So, because he seems to use that as an example of the indigenous American Indian as a kind of noble savage. So, and that's an area of my PhD research at present, which I'm sort of pursuing. So I was really interested in Ed's analysis of that particular view.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That's are you in Bolton now?
No, I'm in Southampton, but
Okay.
yeah, I speak to Paul Salverson and so forth, and
Well, give my love to Paul.
I would do.
He's a dear old friend, and I haven't seen him in years, but I do keep in touch with him, and he's done so much amazing work on Whitman in Lancashire.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the Edward Carpenter quote as the American Indian is a kind of noble savage. That passage, if I wanted to go to the trouble of sharing a screen again, we could call that passage up. But I think most of you,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Uh,
No, I was just saying it was giving me trouble getting back to share the screen. Go ahead and share your screen.
okay, I'll call that up here.
Okay.
So are you all seeing that passage now? Well, I got to share it. Hold on. You all seeing that passage now?
Now still has the Q&A. Yeah. Oh, there it goes. There it goes.
Okay. So the friendly and flowing savage, who is he? Is he waiting for civilization or past it and mastering it? Is he some Southwesterner raised outdoors? Is he Canadian? Is he from the Mississippi country, Iowa, Oregon, California, the mountains, prairie life, bush life, or sailor from the sea? Wherever he goes, men and women accept and desire him. They desire he should be like them, touch them, speak to them, stay with them. Behavior lawless as snowflakes, words simple as grass, uncombed head, laughter and naivete, slow stepping feet, common features, common modes and emanations. They descend in new forms from the tips of his fingers. They are wafted with the odor of his body or breath. They fly out of the glance of his eyes. It's, I think, one of the more amazing passages in Song of Myself. And over the years, it's been read in so many different ways. You know, is this Whitman talking about, you know, kind of the terms of the 19th century historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote the essay about the closing of the frontier, and who wrote about how, you know, we think of the Euro-Americans who went out west and interacted with the Native Americans in the west of the Mississippi, the trappers and the hunters and the traders who went out there, who took on Indian dress, who took on Indian mannerisms, who in many cases learned Indian languages in order to interact with. You saw the Alfred Jacob Miller painting that Whitman used as the basis for the marriage of the trapper and the red girl. And that interaction and intermelding of the two races that Turner always said, you know, the great tension in America in the 19th century was whether you saw those trappers and hunters as frontiersmen or as backwoodsmen, right? Whether they were the front of American civilization, the kind of organizing energy of American civilization, in which case frontiersman is the term. They're at the front of American civilization. They're attaching themselves to the wilderness. They're attaching themselves to the natives, and they are being transformed in this interaction into this new friendly and flowing savage, into this new American who's emerging not from the more cultured European East, but from the un-Europeanized West. And their behavior is different. And Whitman celebrated, you know, those Western Americans who didn't worry about fancy dress and whose speech had become common and not at all cultured. And he celebrated that emerging democracy. If, on the other hand, you saw America as primarily looking for its energy from European models, then those people who went out west were backwoodsmen. They were the entering into the place that American culture and society turned its back on rather than its front toward. And Turner's point is that both of these have major supporters. And in some ways you can track it right up to the present, that there's that tension between those who saw the stripping of Europeanized dress codes and speech codes and mannerisms. You can track this in all of the etiquette books that came out in the 19th century. You have European-based etiquette books that are trying to teach Americans how to drink tea properly and how to dress properly for various occasions. And then you have what are called Republican etiquette books, those books that are telling you that no, the new etiquette for Americans is you don't dress up, you dress down, so that, wearing jeans to a formal restaurant is just fine. Wearing jeans to a college class and a t-shirt is just fine. It democratizes dress. Everybody can afford jeans and t-shirts. And when everybody begins to wear them, you begin to lose the breakdowns of culture. So one way of reading that section would be to read it as Whitman's imagining of what the American democratic individual is going to be like when that interaction and absorption of the frontiersman with all of the wildness of the west of the Mississippi territories took place, how this new friendly and flowing savage in this case meaning occupant of the woods, as it means in its etymology. And in that case, it's not portraying the noble savage so much as it's portraying the emerging new democratic American that has taken his energy and his impulses from that interaction with the natives out west. And so I've always read this section as one of the points in Whitman's Song of Myself that Native American writers in the 20th and 21st centuries, and I've had the privilege of talking to many of them when they've been out here in Iowa at the university. And when I've asked them questions about Whitman, it's a passage that they often point to and say, here, when I first read Song of Myself, this is a passage that made me fall in love with Whitman. And, so yeah, Whitman certainly, I think Carpenter's right in the sense that Whitman did buy into the noble savage idea. He bought into the idea that individual natives like those that he saw in Washington when he worked in the Indian Bureau were honorable and impressive and articulate and peaceful beings. But when Indians got in swarms, as he called it, then we had the problems that led to all of those battles that I cataloged for you. So I think Carpenter's right in sensing there's something of the noble savage that lies behind this passage, but I think he's wrong in the sense that what Whitman is, I think, trying to image and represent in this passage is not the Indian, but the new democratic American who has taken energy and impulse from an interaction with the native.
Thank you. It's really, really useful. Very, very nuanced response. Thank you.
Let me get out of this
Are
again.
there any other,
Okay.
are there any other questions? If not, I have one. Well, actually two. What years was Whitman, the man, not the poet, the writer, what years did he work at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle? I was trying to remember.
So that would have been in the 1840s.
Okay, because during that time period, I think we talked about it earlier, before everyone came on, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, if you go online, sometime I go online at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock, whatever, and read it from the 1800s. And they were always killing off the last Native American on Long Island.
Yes.
And then it seemed like, even when I was reading your book, that he didn't discover Native Americans until he went to work for, what was it, 1863, when he went to work for the Department of Interior?
Yeah.
Is that when he first started writing about him? That's the question.
Yeah, he actually worked at the Department of the Interior from the end of January through June of 1865.
Oh,
So,
65 it was.
yeah, he was there for 5 months. He worked in the Army Paymaster's office during the, he went to Washington, D.C. during the war in 1863 and worked for the Army Paymaster, and then got the job at the Indian Bureau. The Indian Bureau is where the Secretary of the Interior, another Methodist minister named James Harlan, was walking through the Indian Bureau, which was under his command as Secretary of the Interior, and he was looking at the desks of the clerks. It was a relatively small office. There were really only a handful of people who worked there, and Whitman was one of them. And when he came to Whitman's desk, he found Whitman's copy of the 1860 Leaves of Grass that Whitman used as his working copy. Whitman had made all kinds of notations in the book and so on. And James Harlan, the Secretary of the Interior, picked it up and he started just leafing through it, and was so outraged by what he saw and he felt was immoral that Whitman was fired from the Indian Bureau and the Department of the Interior. And that's what led James O'Connor to write the little pamphlet called The Good Gray Poet that spoke out against Harlan and against the US government for firing this poet who had dedicated his life to taking care of and nursing the wounded and dying soldiers of the Civil War in the various Washington hospitals. So that little period of time in the Indian Bureau is often most remembered as the time that led to Whitman becoming a celebrated cause of small-minded government trying to shut down America's artists in their free speech. But for Whitman, the period, those 5 months, were incredibly important in his own emerging views of Native Americans because he actually attended those negotiations. Again, it was a very small office, and while his job was pretty much taking notes and being a clerk, he didn't take part in the actual negotiations. He experienced them, was there when those various Native delegations came to Washington, and had a chance to talk with Native Americans. And as virtually every Euro-American who entered into those negotiations testifies, those natives who came in those delegations were incredibly impressive people.
That's very good. Are there any other questions? I see Phil, are you still on? Unmute. Phil? No, I guess maybe he got off. But
Sandi, it's Cynthia here. I see Bob had his hand up before.
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see
I
it.
didn't know if you can see all the screen. Bob, please join the conversation.
Oh, there's two or three Bobs.
Yeah. I had to end up just quickly on I enjoyed the talk very, very much. Just on that question of the passage about the savage, I mean, I always read that as a sort of, following up on the sort of Natty Bumppo figure, right? Person who civilization is chasing him, right? It's not the other way. And soon there won't be any place left for people like him, much like there won't be any place left for Native people, that they're all sort of going the same way. And we can admire them for all of these amazing traits, but we can't ever pretend that that's what the future is, right? The future, they are not part of the future.
Yeah.
But the real question I had was, in Song of Myself and so many other poems, Whitman seems to be speaking for others, speaking for the escaped slave, speaking for the downtrodden, speaking for the outsider. And I was just thinking about that he doesn't seem to speak as much for Native people. And I'm not sure why that is. And then I think, can you say more about his actual interactions? I mean, you just spoke about him in the office, but his actual interactions, maybe on Long Island with some Native people? Are there any story? I don't know. Are there any stories about that we have? Does he ever write about those interactions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There are no comparable passages to passages like Whitman's I in Song of Myself merging with the escaped slave, for instance. When the slave is being chased by the slave catchers and the slave is being whipped, Whitman's I merges with the slave and speaks as the slave and feels the lash and feels the pain of the slave. And we never get that attempt to merge the I with the Native American. What we get instead is an attempt to pull into the American language Native words. That becomes the kind of absorptive side. I will get to your question about Whitman on Long Island, but first I just want to say that your analysis of the kind of Natty Bumppo figure who, like the Native American, inevitably is going to have to disappear because the civilization is the line of civilization, the closing of the frontier is happening very quickly, and that line is moving across. I think in what I was saying about the friendly and flowing savage passage, Whitman's hope, and shared this with Frederick Jackson Turner, that the frontier is closed. We've ended a period of American history, but has that experience of moving across the continent altered the Euro-American enough that the American now, the previous Euro-American has become Americanized, as that aspects of the Natty Bumppo from the way Americans dress, which has now been so imitated by European cultures that you can't tell the difference anymore. But for a long time you could. It was a much more casual America's obsession with guns. Frederick Jackson Turner would say, it's easy to figure where that obsession comes from. It's because America has that frontier backwoods experience that it has never gotten rid of. It is part of what America became and how it differentiates itself from the rest of the world. You could go on and on with various American characteristics that come up in our political discourse day after day today, can be traced back to what it was that was altering European character as it interacted with that basically couple of century experience on the North American continent. As far as Whitman's own experiences, beyond recalling that he had seen Native Americans on Long Island, the most extended passage, and it's in the poem that eventually he would call The Sleepers, he has a long passage where he recalls something a story that his mother would relive again and again about a Native woman who came to their door when Whitman was a small boy and was looking for work to cane chairs or whatever. And Whitman's mother invited her into the house. They sat and they talked for a long period of time. Whitman's mother does not offer her work, but expresses a kind of deep, inexplicable love for this Native woman who leaves the house and is never heard from again. And I think of Sandi mentioning how Whitman and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, as well as many other local newspapers on Long Island, would announce the death of the last native on Long Island. It's part of that inevitable disappearance. And it seems to be captured in that moment in a wonderfully strange, queer sort of love between Whitman's mother and that Indian woman, but also that strange sense that she gives her no work and sends her finally off, and that woman disappears from the poem and from history. She's just gone. But that's the most extended memory we have, if in fact it is a memory.
Comment on his trip. Could you comment on his trip he took to Montaukett? Do you, or is that something that they just wrote about in the Daily Eagle? He takes the trip to go fishing in Montaukett, and he sees Native Americans, and that's when he had that negative view.
Yeah, the one you had up at the
yeah. They were around him. It's just like I mentioned, in walking distance from the Walt Whitman birthplace. Oh, I see somebody's hand up. In walking distance from Walt Whitman's birthplace, there was this whole cluster of the Baileys, in fact, the Brewster family and the Hendrickson family and a couple of others all lived in this cluster, known Native American cluster.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and his mother had to have contact, and I know his grandparents did.
Right. So it's again part of that ambivalence and tension in Whitman that he could go to Montaukett and encounter natives and write as negatively as he did, and then have this long passage in the sleepers of
Romanticized, yeah.
celebrating the native woman who seems to form in just a couple of hours a deep, affectionate bond with his mother, even as she then disappears from family history and Long Island history and US history.
We have one more question, Margaret. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, great. I put in the chat a quote that I had found when I was scouring the historic newspapers. It's from the Philadelphia Press of August 5th, 1883, when Whitman was mature in his thinking and his feelings. And this comes from a letter that he sent to the Philadelphia Press. And I put the quote in the chat, but I'll read it. It says, "Then another point relating to American ethnology, past and to come, I will here touch upon at a venture. As to our Aboriginal or Indian population, the Aztec in the South, and many a tribe in the North and West, I know it seems to be agreed that they must gradually dwindle as time rolls on, and in a few generations more leave only a reminiscence, a blank. But I am not at all clear about that. As America, from its many back sources and current supplies, develops, adapts, entwines, faithfully identifies as its own, are we to see it cheerfully accepting and using all the contributions of foreign lands from the whole outside globe, and then rejecting the only ones distinctly its own, the autochthonic ones?" So he was giving thought, to losing the Native American culture, which he felt was important for America to incorporate. But it seems also to support everything said today, how he believed that the Native Americans would die out and fade into history.
Margaret, thank you so much for putting that quote up. It's a perfect way to end the discussion today. It captures everything about those tensions and ambivalences that I think mark everything about Whitman's interactions with Native Americans. It's a beautiful quotation to conclude today's session with, and I thank you for bringing it to everybody's attention.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Ed. I've learned a lot, and I will be back in your online Walt Whitman archives too. Cynthia, I don't know if you wanted to do some closing remarks.
Yes, I would like to. Thank you, Sandi, and thank you, Ed. Always enlightening and a pleasure to hear from both of you. And as I say, when I work here, I learn something new about Whitman every day I step into the office. I appreciate you coming, and to the audience who is here, we are thrilled to have you. If it's your first time, come back again. Sandi put up the series. If you've been here before, thank you for rejoining us. Come and visit if you live nearby on Long Island. Our doors are always open. Again, thank you, and thank all of you again. So Sandi, would you like to say some closing remarks?
Yes, next month, John Strong will be talking, I think it's the 17th. He'll be talking about eugenics study, and this was a study done over at the Cold Spring Harbor Museum. I mean, not the Cold Spring Harbor Museum. The, what's the name of it? The Cold Spring Harbor Labs. And it's really fascinating. So I'm looking forward to that. So mark them on your calendar, on your Google calendar. August 17th, this is the commercial. September 21st, the boarding schools. And I'm loving putting that together with Marguerite Smith. And then the October 4th, the missionaries, and that's with Linford Fisher, professor. I'm on one of his committees at Brown. And then on the 18th of November, Chief Harry Wallace from the Uncochog is going to be talking about language. And then we have the whalemen. And that's December 3rd. And that's going to be on site. So mark your calendars and hope to see you there. And thank you.